The night was heavy with anticipation. Cameras whirred. Microphones leaned forward like weapons ready to capture every syllable. The stage was set for another political spectacle, the kind America had grown accustomed to, loud, divisive, and dripping with tension. And then, with the flick of a smile, Donald J. Trump, ever the showman, ever the provocateur, leaned into the microphone. His voice, sharp and mocking, sliced through the silence. The words he chose were not policy-driven. They were not rooted in governance, diplomacy, or leadership. No, his attack was personal, calculated, and designed to sting. He sneered as he uttered the phrase, "woke trash." The air seemed to freeze. Gasps rippled across the audience like a wave breaking against jagged rocks. The insult wasn't just directed at Representative Jasmine Crockett, though her name was the immediate target. It was aimed at a broader idea, a growing movement, a rising generation of voices demanding justice, accountability, and change. With 2 words, Trump sought to belittle it all. But in that moment, before Crockett even opened her mouth, the scene itself became iconic. The villain had stepped forward, cloaked in arrogance, wielding ridicule like a blade. And the crowd knew instinctively, a reckoning was coming. Because across from him, standing steady, her eyes calm yet blazing with controlled fire, was Jasmine Crockett. The contrast was almost cinematic, Trump, leaning back with smug laughter echoing in his chest, versus Crockett, upright and unmoved, a storm gathering behind her silence. It was the perfect stage for what was about to unfold. The insult hung in the air, replayed instantly across cell phones, whispered in stunned tones to neighbors in the audience. Online, it exploded. Twitter timelines lit up like fireworks. Hashtags surged, hashtag woke trash, hashtag Crockett versus Trump, hashtag shocking insult. Clips were already being uploaded, memes already spreading, outrage already boiling. But what no one knew yet, what no one could possibly anticipate, was the clapback that would follow. A clapback so precise, so cutting, so unshakably powerful that it wouldn't just silence the room. It would ripple outward, freezing the crowd in stunned disbelief, and echo across America with the force of a cultural earthquake. This was not just another political exchange. This was the clash of archetypes. On one side, the embodiment of arrogance, showmanship, and raw mockery. On the other, the embodiment of resilience, dignity, and truth. Hero versus villain. Light versus shadow. Calm dignity versus searing insult. And as America leaned closer, waiting for Crockett's reply, they didn't just want a comeback. They craved a moment of reckoning. They longed for words that would pierce through the noise, that would prove once again that dignity could still stand tall in the face of ridicule. But before that moment could arrive, the silence had to deepen. The insult had to echo. The audience had to feel the sting of injustice, the raw humiliation of a public attack. Because only then, only after the villain painted the stage in arrogance, could the hero step forward and rewrite the script. The stage was a battlefield, but no fists would be thrown here. This was a war of words, a duel of narratives, a high-stakes confrontation played out not just in the room, but across the nation. Every camera lens was aimed, every microphone armed, every heartbeat quickened. And as Crockett inhaled, steadying herself for the storm she was about to unleash, one truth became undeniable: this was a moment history would replay. For this was the night Donald Trump mocked Jasmine Crockett as woke trash. And this was the night her clapback froze the crowd. But the road to that frozen silence, the path to that unforgettable reckoning, had layers. It had context, history, wounds, and patterns. Because Trump's insult wasn't born in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of rhetoric, years of mockery, years of deliberate attacks meant to divide. And Crockett's response wasn't just words, it was a declaration, forged from battles past, sharpened by resilience, infused with the unshakable spirit of someone who had been underestimated too many times before. The stage was not just political, it was personal. And America was about to witness the collision. To understand the gravity of that single insult, we have to rewind. This wasn't the first time Trump had weaponized language. He had built a career out of branding enemies with nicknames, boiling down complex opposition into soundbites designed to wound. Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe, Pocahontas. Each insult had become a headline, each phrase a viral echo chamber, spreading through rallies and social feeds like wildfire. For his supporters, it was entertainment. For his detractors, it was degradation. But for Trump himself, it was strategy, a way to reduce his opponents to caricatures, to strip them of nuance and force them into roles he defined. And now, it was Jasmine Crockett's turn. She was young compared to the political heavyweights who had sparred with Trump. She was unapologetic, vocal, and willing to clash with those who underestimated her. For some, she was a rising star. For others, she was a threat, a new face of progress, unafraid to challenge the old guard. That night, the insult wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was a choice. Trump could have attacked her policies. He could have questioned her arguments. Instead, he chose to demean her identity, her values, and by extension, an entire movement that demanded change. The word woke was already a cultural flashpoint. To some, it symbolized awareness, empathy, a demand for justice. To others, it had been twisted into a pejorative, a shorthand for everything they despised about modern progress. By attaching trash to it, Trump wasn't just mocking Crockett. He was mocking the millions who dared to believe America could be better, fairer, more just. And in doing so, he raised the stakes. The insult wasn't just two words. It was a gauntlet, thrown at the feet of every person who believed in progress. And Jasmine Crockett, standing steady in the spotlight, became the vessel for their collective reply. The audience didn't know it yet, but the energy in the room was shifting. Trump had delivered his line with smug confidence, expecting laughter, applause, validation. And yes, some chuckled. A handful cheered. But more gasped. More turned to one another, eyes wide, mouths open. The tension was not playful. It was raw. Because beneath the surface, something else was building. Crockett's silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. She let the insult hang. She let the sting settle. She allowed the audience to feel the weight of Trump's words before she even considered breaking her own silence. That silence was power. And across the nation, millions were waiting. Social media didn't sleep. Within seconds, the clip was clipped, captioned, shared. Outrage built in real time. Headlines formed before her response even began. Trump calls Crockett woke trash on stage. The insult alone was viral. But the reply? That was the unknown. That was the storm. That was what everyone craved. Because history had taught them, when underestimated, Jasmine Crockett did not shrink. She rose. And when she rose, she struck with precision. This wasn't just political theater. This was moral theater. It was the ancient clash between arrogance and dignity, staged in front of cameras but replayed in living rooms, classrooms, and online forums. It was America's eternal drama, the bully versus the brave. And the bully had just taken his swing. But what happens when the brave finally answers? The answer was coming. And as Crockett lifted her head, the entire room held its breath. What she said next, what she unleashed in that moment, was not just a clapback. It was a cultural detonation. It was the kind of response that makes history freeze, rewind, and replay. And when it arrived, the crowd wouldn't cheer at first. They would fall silent. Because some words don't just land, they shake the ground beneath you. The silence after Trump's insult was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of discomfort, of people realizing that a line had been crossed. Some shuffled in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Others raised their phones higher, eager to capture the storm that was about to unfold. For in that pause, Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became the embodiment of every American who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or mocked for daring to speak truth to power. She was not a household name to everyone before this moment. But she was about to be. Because this was not a battle of equals in stature or fame. It was David and Goliath, the towering figure of a former president against a younger representative still carving her place in history. But that very imbalance gave the moment its electricity. The insult was meant to reduce her to nothing. But instead, it magnified her. Around the country, families sitting in living rooms leaned forward. College students in dorms shouted at their screens. Workers on late-night shifts pulled out earbuds to listen more closely. Something about the energy of that room transmitted beyond its walls. It felt alive. It felt urgent. Trump stood there, arms crossed, satisfied with his attack. He believed he had won the moment. He had seen this playbook work countless times before. A sharp insult, a degrading label, a smirk, a laugh, it was a cycle that rarely failed. But this time, he underestimated his opponent. Crockett's silence was unnerving. She didn't flinch. She didn't scowl. She didn't break eye contact. She simply waited. The crowd grew restless. The seconds stretched like minutes. Trump's smirk wavered ever so slightly. And then, without raising her voice, without breaking into anger, Crockett leaned into the microphone. And that, right there, is when the night changed. Her words, sharp, precise, and delivered with the weight of generations, would soon explode across every platform, every timeline, every headline. It wasn't just her comeback that would stun the nation. It was the way she wielded dignity like a weapon, turning Trump's insult back on him, making the audience question not her worth, but his. But before those words came, the energy in the air reached its breaking point. Think of a thunderstorm. The moment before the lightning splits the sky. The air heavy, charged, every nerve aware that something unstoppable is about to happen. That's what it felt like in that room. Journalists scribbled faster, unsure of what was about to be written into history. Cameras zoomed tighter, capturing every twitch, every bead of sweat. And millions watching at home whispered to themselves, "What's she going to say?" This was the anatomy of a viral moment. Trump had delivered the bait. And America waited for the strike. And then, Crockett spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. What made it powerful was the calm in its tone, the sharpness in its structure, the refusal to match insult with insult. Instead, she chose something far more devastating. She chose truth. And when truth is wielded against arrogance, the result is unforgettable. Her words, captured forever, did more than silence Trump. They rippled across the nation like shockwaves. They turned the crowd from uneasy witnesses into stunned participants. And they ensured that what began as an insult would end as an echo, one that Trump himself could never escape. Because history has a way of remembering the clapbacks that freeze time. And Jasmine Crockett's was about to be etched in that ledger forever. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. 3 words, delivered with a sneer, carried the weight of decades of division. Woke trash. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a weaponized phrase, sharpened by culture wars and repeated endlessly by those who feared change. Trump knew what he was doing. He knew the power of labels. A single phrase could turn allies against each other, divide households, inflame headlines. It was the kind of language that didn't just belittle, it branded. But what he didn't realize was that branding works both ways. For while he thought he was reducing Jasmine Crockett to a caricature, he was in fact revealing himself. Every camera angle, every microphone, every pair of eyes in the room caught not just his words, but the disdain behind them. And disdain is a dangerous thing to broadcast when millions are watching. Around the country, viewers shifted uncomfortably. Parents watching with their children shook their heads. Veterans of political battles recognized the tactic instantly. It was classic humiliation politics. And younger generations, more attuned to authenticity than bluster, rolled their eyes. But Crockett? She stayed still. Stillness is a powerful form of resistance. Where others might have rushed to defend themselves, she held her ground, letting the weight of his insult collapse under its own emptiness. The longer she stayed silent, the louder the tension grew. It wasn't just about what she would say, it was about what her silence was already saying. And here lies the paradox of power: those who seek to dominate often mistake noise for strength. But true strength, true authority, can often be found in restraint. For Crockett's silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Trump's insult had been designed to provoke, to throw her off balance, to create a soundbite where she appeared flustered or enraged. But by refusing to play into the script, she rewrote the story. And in that rewriting, she became the unexpected protagonist of the night. The crowd didn't know how to respond. Supporters of Trump looked at each other nervously, their laughter faltering. Neutral observers leaned forward, sensing a shift. Even those opposed to her were forced to admit she wasn't cracking. For Crockett was not standing on that stage just as herself. She was standing as the voice of those long dismissed. Every teacher labeled too woke, every activist ridiculed, every ordinary American mocked for caring about dignity and justice. She was carrying them with her. And whether they were watching in real time or would discover it later in a viral clip, they would see themselves in her. This is the anatomy of a cultural turning point. It doesn't come from prepared speeches or staged moments. It comes from raw, unscripted encounters where authenticity collides with arrogance. And that collision creates sparks. Sparks that can light up a room. Sparks that can ignite a movement. Sparks that can burn through the noise and leave only truth standing. On this night, in this moment, one of those sparks had been lit. Trump believed he had ended the exchange before it began. But instead, he had set the stage for a reversal so complete, so devastating, that it would live on far beyond the walls of that venue. Because the story was no longer about an insult. It was about what came after. And what came after was Crockett's clapback. A clapback so precise, so chilling, that it would freeze the crowd, dominate the headlines. And remind America that arrogance cannot silence resilience. The insult was just the beginning. The real story was about to begin. Insults in politics are nothing new. History is littered with them. From the Senate floor of centuries past to the presidential debates of modern times, barbed words have often replaced real arguments. But rarely does a single insult crystallize so many tensions at once. Woke trash. It wasn't simply a jab at Jasmine Crockett. It was a declaration aimed at millions. Teachers who dared to discuss history. Activists who fought for justice. Parents who wanted equality for their children. Everyday citizens who believed in fairness and dignity. And that's why the room froze. Because everyone knew this moment wasn't just about her, it was about them. The cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, capturing the smirk of a man who thought he had landed the final blow. The lights reflected off his expression, making him appear larger than life, dominating the stage. But if the cameras had lingered longer on the audience, the story would have been different. Because in the seats, something subtle was shifting. Supporters who expected thunderous applause instead found themselves clapping half-heartedly, their confidence shaken. Skeptics in the back began nodding at each other, sensing that the balance of power had tilted, if only slightly. The room itself became a character, a battlefield of energy, silence, and anticipation. And Crockett? She didn't fidget. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't even blink rapidly. She simply stood still, grounded, anchored by something larger than the moment. That stillness was contagious. The longer she waited, the more it unnerved the crowd. Silence became her ally. While Trump relied on noise, cheers, jeers, the echo of his own voice, Crockett wielded quiet like a weapon. And in that silence, she gave space for something extraordinary: reflection. Reflection is rare in political theater. Crowds don't come to think, they come to react. But Crockett's stillness forced them to pause. Forced them to confront what had just been said. For in that pause, even Trump's own words began to sound uglier, harsher, more out of place. And reflection spreads. It travels from one corner of the room to another, from one television screen to millions, from a clip on social media to conversations around dinner tables. The silence was no longer empty, it was full. Full of meaning. Full of judgment. Full of the quiet but undeniable recognition that something had shifted. Moments like these are rare. They come without warning, without rehearsal. They are lightning strikes. And when they happen, they remind us why live events hold such power. Because no matter how scripted politics becomes, authenticity cannot be faked. And in that moment, the authenticity belonged to Jasmine Crockett. The insult may have been loud, but authenticity always echoes louder. Commentators watching from home scrambled to prepare their takes. Was this another example of Trump's dominance, or had he overplayed his hand? Some pundits predicted Crockett would fumble her reply, collapsing under the weight of such a public attack. Others, however, saw the glint in her eye and whispered, "Wait. Something's coming." And they were right. For Crockett had not come to be insulted. She had come prepared for battle. And when she finally opened her mouth, her words would do more than defend her, they would dismantle the very stage her opponent had tried to own. But before we get to that thunderous clapback, we must understand the attack itself, why it mattered, why it stung, and why it revealed more about the man who spoke it than the woman it targeted. For this was not merely an insult. This was a mirror. And what it reflected was a nation at war with itself. The next act would make that painfully clear. The villain's attack. The word attack in politics doesn't always mean fists or weapons. Sometimes, it's sharper. Sometimes, it's more calculated. Sometimes, it's a string of syllables deliberately chosen to cut deeper than any blade. And on that night, Donald Trump wielded his weapon of choice, language. Woke trash. Two words stitched together, hurled like stones. The first, woke, a modern battlefield of meaning. To some, it symbolized awareness, progress, empathy. To others, it had been twisted into a slur, a shorthand for everything they despised about change. The second, trash, needed no interpretation. A word of dismissal. A word that seeks to erase. A word that does not debate but discards. Together, they formed a weaponized label. Not an argument. Not a point of view. A dismissal so total, it reduced a human being to debris. Trump's delivery was no accident. The sneer, the timing, the performative pause that followed, it was theater. He knew how to land lines that would ricochet through social media, through headlines, through the conversations of ordinary people. This was his power, the ability to turn language into spectacle. But spectacle cuts both ways. Because while his supporters cheered, millions watching at home recoiled. Parents wondered how a leader could so easily model disrespect. Teachers shook their heads, knowing their own students had been branded with similar insults. Workers in every corner of America felt the sting, recognizing the pattern, the powerful belittling the voices of those who dared to challenge them. And Crockett? She became the stand-in for them all. Trump's strategy was clear. Reduce, ridicule, and dominate. In the realm of branding, he had mastered the art of turning opponents into slogans. Crooked Hillary. Sleepy Joe. Names that stuck, not because they were true, but because repetition made them feel true. And now, he tried to add another to his arsenal, woke trash. But there was a difference this time. This time, his target wasn't just a politician. It wasn't just an opponent in a single election. This time, he targeted a movement. An idea. A generation that refused to be silenced. And ideas cannot be reduced so easily. The attack landed like a hammer, but Crockett's calm was the anvil that absorbed the blow. Every second she remained still, the insult bounced back on its source. Trump wanted to create a caricature of weakness. Instead, he revealed his own fear. For insults are not born from strength, they are born from insecurity. And when a leader leans on mockery instead of reason, the audience cannot help but ask, what is he afraid of? The insults spread instantly. Clips appeared online within minutes. Headlines raced to capture the drama. Some outlets framed it as another example of Trump's dominance. Others questioned whether he had gone too far. But the most powerful voices were not pundits or journalists. They were the people. On TikTok, on Twitter, on Instagram, ordinary Americans replayed the moment, dissected it, shared it with captions that revealed the truth. Disgusting. Typical. Watch how she handles this. Because what viewers craved was not just the attack, they craved the response. Every insult carries within it a hidden test. Will the target crumble? Will they lash out? Or will they rise? Trump's supporters expected the first two. They wanted Crockett flustered. They wanted her angry. They wanted her to confirm the caricature he had painted. But what they got was something entirely different. And that difference would change everything. Because Crockett's reply, calm, cold, devastating, would not only silence a crowd. It would redefine the battlefield. And it would prove, once again, that arrogance may win the moment, but dignity always wins the day. Words are not simply sounds in the air. They are arrows. Once released, they cannot be taken back. They fly forward, pierce targets, and sometimes hit places the archer never intended. Trump's arrow, woke trash, was meant for Jasmine Crockett. But its sharpness cut wider. It struck young voters who saw their own values mocked. It struck families who had taught their children respect, only to see a leader model contempt. It struck allies who wondered whether insults had replaced leadership. And in striking so many, the arrow revealed the very fragility of the hand that launched it. There is a paradox in political insults. The more often they are used, the less power they hold. Like a weapon wielded without precision, their edges grow dull, their impact diminished. But Trump had built an empire on insults. It was his signature move. To retreat from it now would be to abandon his own identity. And so, he leaned on it once again, believing that the crowd would rally, that Crockett would falter, that history would repeat itself. But history does not always repeat. Sometimes, it rewrites. Around the country, living rooms became debate halls. Supporters defended the insult as tough talk. Critics condemned it as cruelty. But even those inclined to cheer began to feel the tremor of overreach. Because something about the phrase felt hollow. Too rehearsed. Too obvious. And when mockery feels hollow, the target gains strength. In the audience, body language told the story. Some leaned back, crossing their arms. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The initial cheer had been loud, but short-lived. Applause faltered. Laughter thinned. It was as if the room itself recognized that the moment had crossed from entertainment into something darker. For an insult can entertain until it reveals the cruelty behind it. And cruelty has a way of souring even the most loyal cheers. Crockett knew this. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to match insult with insult. Her weapon was timing. Her strategy was patience. She understood something fundamental about human psychology: silence magnifies. The more she withheld, the more his words echoed back on him. It was no longer about what he said. It was about how it looked that she refused to flinch. In every great story, villains reveal themselves not through action, but through excess. Their downfall comes not because their enemies are stronger, but because they overreach. And here, on this stage, Trump had overreached. By calling her woke trash, he revealed the very smallness of his imagination. By attempting to erase her, he had amplified her. By seeking to dominate, he had exposed his insecurity. The crowd didn't yet know it, but they were witnessing a turning point. Online, the clip began its viral climb. Accounts replayed it with captions that varied from shock to mockery. Some wrote, "This is leadership?" Others noted, "Watch her face, she's waiting." Just wait. The internet thrives on anticipation, and anticipation was building like a storm. Even Trump's own supporters grew restless. They knew what was coming. Every insult begs a response. And when it doesn't come immediately, the anticipation grows unbearable. And anticipation is dangerous. It creates the possibility that the reply will outshine the attack. Which is exactly what was about to happen. For Crockett's reply would not be loud. It would not be angry. It would not even be long. But it would be devastating. A reply so cold, so precise, that the room would freeze. A reply that turned insult into exposure, mockery into mirror, and arrogance into silence. The insult was the spark. But the reply would be the fire. Political theater thrives on conflict. But not all conflicts are equal. Some are battles of policy, fought with data and evidence. Others are battles of image, fought with optics and performance. And then there are battles like this one, battles of dignity, where the real prize is not applause, but respect. Trump's insult revealed his strategy. He was not arguing policy. He was not debating law. He was attempting to reduce his opponent to a punchline. But when you try to make a leader into a punchline, you risk turning yourself into the joke. The crowd's energy wavered. Some cheered out of loyalty, but others hesitated. Hesitation is dangerous in politics. A crowd without unity becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability, in front of cameras, becomes a story of its own. Journalists in the room scribbled furiously. Headlines were already forming in their minds. Trump resorts to personal insult. Woke trash? Crowd divided on remark. Crockett holds silence after mockery. The story was writing itself. And Trump wasn't holding the pen. Meanwhile, in living rooms across America, televisions flickered with live coverage. Families watched, jaws tight. Some laughed nervously, unsure whether they should find humor in the insult or shame in its delivery. For parents, it was a question, what lesson does this teach my children? For workers, it was a reflection, is this what leadership looks like, mocking, sneering, reducing others to trash? And for young activists, it was fuel, if they call us trash, then maybe we're onto something. Maybe we've scared them enough to lash out. But Crockett's silence spoke louder than his insult. It was the kind of silence that filled the air like a storm cloud. Every second she did not respond magnified the insult, not as a wound, but as evidence. She was letting him hang by his own words. Commentators on social media began to split-screen the moment. On one side, Trump, animated, mocking, sneering. On the other, Crockett, composed, still, patient. Two images, two energies. Hero versus villain. Chaos versus calm. And viewers couldn't look away. There is an ancient truth about power, it does not like being ignored. When power mocks and receives silence, the silence grows unbearable. Trump had expected outrage. He had expected Crockett to defend, to argue, to prove him wrong. Instead, she simply looked at him, eyes steady, face unmoved. And that is when silence became the weapon. Clips of the moment began spreading under captions like, "This silence is everything." Others read, "She's about to bury him." It was the prelude before the storm, the intake of breath before the blow. And everyone watching knew, when she finally spoke, it would not be ordinary. But Trump, blinded by his own momentum, pressed on. He mistook silence for weakness. He leaned harder into his performance, pacing the stage, gesturing wildly, repeating the insult for emphasis. What he failed to realize was that repetition does not strengthen an insult, it weakens it. What once sounded sharp now sounded desperate. What once felt bold now felt brittle. And as the words left his lips again, the insult began to collapse under its own weight. In the back of the hall, young people whispered to one another. They had seen this pattern before, a man overplaying his hand, a woman waiting for the perfect moment to dismantle him. It was a story as old as time. And they knew how it ended. The online conversation expanded beyond politics. Teachers wrote about bullying. Ministers spoke of respect. Therapists weighed in on the damage of words meant to dehumanize. What had begun as a political jab had now spilled into a national conversation about dignity, identity, and the power of language. And in that conversation, Crockett was no longer just a politician. She was becoming a symbol. But symbols are not made in silence forever. They are made when silence finally breaks. And break it would. Because the moment was coming when Crockett would deliver her response, a response not forged in anger, not fueled by insult, but sharpened by clarity. It would be a clapback so cold, so precise, that it froze the very air in the room. A moment destined for replay, destined for history. The insult had been launched. The silence had built the tension. Now, the reply would unleash the reckoning. The silence had stretched to its breaking point. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of Crockett's expression, every twitch of her jaw, every glint in her eyes. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for the words she hadn't yet spoken. This was no longer about Trump's insult. It was about the response America was waiting for. And then, at last, she spoke. Her voice did not rise. It did not tremble. It cut through the noise with a chilling calmness, the kind of calm that draws more power than rage ever could. "You call me woke trash," she began, her tone even, steady, unwavering. The room froze. Crockett repeated his insult, not to validate it, but to frame it. To place it under the cold light of scrutiny. She lifted the words like evidence in a trial, holding them up not just for Trump, but for the entire nation. And then came the pause. That razor-sharp pause. The pause that made every camera, every microphone, every eye in the room lock onto her. "You know what trash is?" she continued, voice still steady. "Trash is when leaders fail their people. Trash is when truth is discarded for applause. Trash is when division is more valuable than dignity." The crowd erupted, not in laughter, not in jeers, but in gasps. Crockett had done what few expected. She had taken the insult and turned it into a mirror, one that reflected not weakness in her, but rot in the system he embodied. And in that single reversal, the balance of power shifted. Trump's face tightened. His smirk faltered. He had thrown the punch, but she had transformed it into evidence against him. The hero-villain contrast was now crystal clear, playing out in real time before millions of eyes. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice sharpening like steel. "You think words like woke and trash can reduce people to nothing. But what you don't understand," she said, "is that every insult you throw becomes a badge of honor. Because it tells us one thing: you're afraid. Afraid of change. Afraid of truth. Afraid of the people you can't control." The hall shook with reaction. Cheers mingled with stunned silence. Phones shot into the air, live streaming, recording, broadcasting the moment into the bloodstream of the internet. Social media timelines ignited. Crockett just destroyed Trump on live TV. This is the moment of the year. Her calmness is lethal. For years, Trump had mastered the art of dominating a room, bending narratives, controlling headlines. But in this instant, the control slipped. The narrative was no longer his. It was hers. And she wasn't letting go. She continued, layering her words like bricks, building an unshakable case. America deserves leaders who uplift, not demean. Leaders who see every citizen as valuable, not disposable. Leaders who can argue policy without attacking humanity. That's what this country was built on, and that's what we're not letting you take away. It wasn't just a response. It was a manifesto. A declaration. A redefinition of the moment. And as the cameras captured Trump's uneasy shifting, the villain of the narrative looked smaller than ever before. Commentators watching live scrambled to react. "She's turning it into a moral indictment," one analyst whispered on air. "This isn't just politics, this is theater." Another added, "Trump's weapon was mockery. But she just neutralized it with dignity. And dignity, once unleashed, is hard to stop." But Crockett wasn't only speaking to Trump. She was speaking to America. To every viewer who had ever been called a name, dismissed, devalued. She was giving them language, giving them a voice. Her reply had transformed from a counterattack into something larger, a cultural moment. And yet, the drama was only beginning. Because for every word she spoke, for every truth she dropped, Trump's impatience grew. The villain does not take humiliation lightly. And his instinct was always to strike back, louder, harder, more desperate. The question now was not whether he would respond, but how. And in that uncertainty, America held its breath. Would he regain control? Would he escalate beyond words? Or had Crockett's cold, calculated reply already written the ending? Trump's instinct, as always, was to fight back. His jaw tightened, his hands gripped the lectern, and he leaned toward the microphone with the force of a man who could not accept silence as defeat. The smirk returned, though thinner now, almost desperate. He gestured with his hands, palms slicing the air in dramatic bursts. "Folks, look at this," he sneered, his voice louder now, harsher, pitched to reclaim authority. "Another radical Democrat lecturing us on dignity. She's a joke. She's not even." But before the sentence could land, the crowd itself turned volatile. Some cheered, loyal to him, unwilling to abandon their champion. But others booed, their voices cutting into the noise like cracks in an old foundation. For the first time in a long time, Trump's dominance of a stage was not absolute. Crockett did not interrupt. She didn't need to. She simply stood, hands clasped, head held high, her stillness louder than his shouting. It was a lesson in contrast. He thrashed, she endured. He blustered, she radiated control. The cameras, hungry for drama, split-screened the moment, Trump's face flushed with agitation on one side, Crockett's composed defiance on the other. Social media lit up instantly. "Why does she look like the president here, and he looks like a heckler?" The contrast is everything. Calm versus chaos. She doesn't even have to say anything, he's unraveling on his own. Trump slammed the podium with an open hand, the sound reverberating through the hall like a gavel gone mad. He launched into another insult, painting Crockett as a puppet, as un-American, as unfit. But each word carried less weight than the last. Because the crowd had already witnessed the shift. They had seen the insult turned into a weapon against its wielder. And then Crockett spoke again. Softly. So softly that the microphone seemed to lean forward to catch her words. "You can shout," she said. "You can mock. You can call me every name you can think of. But none of that will ever change the truth." The hall hushed. The silence was absolute. "The truth," she continued, her tone deliberate, "is that insults are the weapon of the powerless. And if that's all you have left, then maybe you've already lost." Gasps. Then an eruption. The crowd broke into applause, a rolling thunder of approval that washed over her words and sealed them in history. Trump tried to shout over it, his voice cracking under the roar, but the applause drowned him out. For the first time, the so-called master of the crowd was no longer in command. Commentators scrambled. "This is historic," one said breathlessly. "We are watching a complete reversal of power dynamics." Another analyst whispered on live air, he called her trash. She turned him into the one looking small, unhinged, desperate. "That's not just a comeback, that's a demolition." The villain had swung his sword, but the hero had caught it, twisted it, and pointed it back at him. And America was watching, spellbound. Yet, the story was not over. Trump was not a man who accepted humiliation. The more cornered he felt, the more ferocious his attacks became. The real question loomed like a storm cloud: how far would he go to try to reclaim the stage? And as Crockett's words echoed in the hearts of millions, the villain prepared his most desperate strike yet, one that could either break the moment or cement his downfall forever. Trump's voice cracked with a rare edge of panic, though he disguised it beneath his usual bravado. He pointed across the stage, jabbing the air toward Crockett like an accuser at trial. "She's not tough. She's not smart. She's nothing without the media propping her up. I built an empire, she couldn't even build a lemonade stand." The crowd split, torn between laughter, gasps, and outright rejection. The insult landed clumsy, hollow, unpolished. It lacked the venom that once made his barbs lethal. Because now, the audience had context, they had seen Crockett absorb the blow and rise above it. The comparison was no longer between equals. It was between a weary showman recycling old tricks and a new contender radiating unshaken resolve. Crockett tilted her head slightly, as though examining his words the way one might inspect a cracked glass, fragile, breakable, barely holding together. And then she smiled. Not a smirk, not a grin, but the kind of smile that spoke of confidence so deep it could not be touched. The crowd stirred, sensing the counterstrike that was sure to come. But she did not rush. Instead, she allowed Trump's words to hang in the air, to wither under the weight of silence. That silence became unbearable. Trump shuffled his notes, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. For a man who thrived on noise, silence was his enemy. Finally, Crockett spoke, her voice calm and cutting. "You can measure a person by the insults they choose. You chose to call me trash. I choose to stand here and show America what dignity looks like." The room erupted. Gasps gave way to cheers, cheers swelled into chants. Her name began to roll through the hall, a rhythm he could not interrupt. "Crockett! Crockett! Crockett!" It was a chant Trump had never heard before. Not for him. Not against him. It was for her, and it was deafening. The camera panned across faces in the crowd, young, old, men, women, some cheering with tears in their eyes, others holding phones aloft to capture the history unfolding before them. Social media went nuclear. Clips of her words spread like wildfire across every platform. On Twitter, Trump called her trash. Crockett turned it into a masterclass in grace. On TikTok, soundbites remixed with dramatic music, captions flashing, "This is the moment Trump lost the crowd." On Instagram, reels looping her calm delivery, contrasted with his red-faced shouting. Trump slammed his hand down again, more desperate now. "They don't love you, they hate me. That's all this is. This isn't about you, it's about me." The words echoed, jagged and raw. And in that instant, he revealed more truth than he intended. Because the crowd realized he was right, in the worst possible way. It wasn't about her alone. It was about him. His fear. His desperation. His inability to tolerate a challenger who could rise without fear. And in revealing it, he exposed the fragility beneath the mask of power. Crockett stepped closer to the podium. She did not raise her voice. She did not point a finger. Instead, she delivered words that landed like a hammer striking stone. "You've just admitted it yourself. This was never about serving America. It was always about you. And that is why your time is ending." The audience froze. The silence this time was different, not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of shock. And then, slowly, applause swelled again, building into a storm, rolling through the hall with a force that rattled the walls. She had not just countered his insult. She had stripped bare his entire philosophy, exposing it as self-serving and hollow. Analysts watching from studios across the nation spoke with awe. "This isn't a debate anymore," one commentator whispered. "It's a reckoning." Another added, Trump came here to mock her. Instead, he's become the stage on which she defines herself. That's power. That's history. The escalation had reached its zenith. Trump, flailing and furious, now faced a choice: retreat into silence or risk an outburst that could destroy what little control he had left. But knowing Trump, retreat was never in his nature. And so, with his pride hanging by a thread and his legacy trembling under Crockett's words, he prepared to unleash one final, desperate assault, an attack so reckless that it could either reclaim his dominance or bury him for good. Trump leaned forward, his face flushed crimson, sweat glistening under the stage lights. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier, as though history itself leaned in to witness what came next. His voice cracked into the microphone, louder than before, his words tumbling out in frantic bursts. She's a fraud. A complete fraud. She doesn't love this country. She doesn't care about you, she only cares about herself. I made America great, and she's here to destroy it. Don't let her fool you. The eruption was deafening, a tirade more unhinged than commanding. He waved his arms wildly, pounding the lectern so hard the microphone quivered. It was a spectacle of chaos. But the effect was not what he intended. Instead of inspiring fear, it inspired pity. Instead of projecting strength, it projected desperation. Cameras zoomed in on the audience. Faces frowned. Eyes narrowed. Even some of his staunchest supporters shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to cheer this time. The chant of Crockett! Crockett rose again, drowning him out, rolling through the crowd like a wave he could not stop. Crockett did not flinch. She did not retreat. She stood like a monument of calm in the storm of his rage. And when the noise subsided, she took one deliberate step forward. The step was symbolic. It was the step of a challenger crossing into the space of power, claiming ground that had once belonged exclusively to him. Her voice came, steady and unwavering. You can scream. You can point. You can accuse. But in the end, every time you lash out, you prove exactly what I've said. This was never about America, it was only ever about Donald Trump. The words rang out like a verdict. Final. Unshakable. The crowd exploded, not in division this time, but in thunderous unity. Applause shook the hall. Cheers rose to the rafters. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted entirely. Trump's face hardened, frozen between fury and disbelief. For the first time, he looked small, diminished by the gravity of her composure, overshadowed by the resonance of her truth. The escalation had reached its climax. The villain had thrown every insult, every trick, every ounce of bluster he had left. And yet, the hero remained unshaken, standing tall, her resolve unbroken. It was not the knockout punch that would come later, but it was the setup, the preparation, the moment where America knew the clapback was coming. And when it came, it would not just silence Trump, it would freeze the crowd, electrify the nation, and echo across history as the night everything changed. The stage was electric, pulsing with anticipation. Donald Trump's tirade still echoed faintly, a ghost of rage hanging in the air. But it was fading now, replaced by something else. Expectation. Every eye locked on Jasmine Crockett. Every camera zoomed in, eager to capture what she would say next. She inhaled slowly, a measured breath that spoke louder than any words. And then, she began. Her voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that carries weight, that slices deeper than anger ever could. You call me names, Mr. Trump. You call me woke trash. You shout, you sneer, you insult. But you know what? Trash doesn't scare easily. Trash doesn't bend. Trash doesn't break. Trash endures, because it's built to survive everything that gets thrown at it. And I've survived far worse than your words. The audience gasped. A ripple swept across the hall. Crockett had taken his insult and twisted it into armor, into a weapon, into poetry. Her words did not just answer him, they redefined the battlefield. Trump shifted uncomfortably, his lips twitching, preparing to interrupt. But Crockett raised her hand slightly, commanding silence without ever breaking her flow. And then came the hammer. You stand here claiming you made America great, when what you really did was divide it. You made neighbors hate each other. You made families tear apart at the dinner table. You made truth optional and chaos mandatory. And now you think calling me trash somehow makes you strong? No, Mr. Trump. It makes you weak. Because a strong man doesn't have to tear others down, he lifts them up. The hall erupted. Applause roared, whistles cut through the air, chants of Jasmine. Jasmine filled the room with unstoppable energy. Trump's mouth opened, but no words came. His hands fumbled against the lectern as though even he felt the ground shift beneath him. Crockett's eyes locked onto his. She wasn't just speaking to him anymore, she was speaking through him, to the nation, to history itself. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping lower, sharper. You tried to define me with your insult. But here's the truth, I don't need your definition. I don't need your approval. I don't even need your respect. Because unlike you, I don't measure my worth by applause or power. I measure it by the people I stand for. And tonight, I stand for every American you ever tried to silence. Silence fell. Not the awkward silence of confusion, but the heavy silence of impact. The kind of silence that happens when thousands of people hear something so raw, so undeniable, they cannot move, cannot breathe, cannot even blink. Trump blinked first. And that's when it happened, the moment Crockett unleashed the line that would freeze the crowd, stun her opponent, and echo across headlines the very next morning. The air was no longer thick with Trump's bluster. It was now charged with Jasmine Crockett's authority. The cameras closed in, capturing every flicker in her eyes, every subtle rise and fall of her tone. And then, with the weight of the nation pressing down, she delivered the blow. You call me woke trash, Mr. Trump. But if standing up for justice, if fighting for dignity, if believing that every American deserves a voice makes me woke, then I will wear that word like a crown. And if defending this country from the lies, the hate, and the division you spread makes me trash, then this trash is strong enough to take you to the curb. The words detonated like dynamite. The crowd erupted, not just in applause, but in a thunderous roar that rattled the walls. Some leapt to their feet, fists in the air. Others pounded on the backs of chairs in a rhythm that sounded like a war drum. Trump froze. His smirk evaporated. For the first time that night, the master of the insult, the king of the sneer, had no retort. The cameras didn't miss it. The hesitation. The falter. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It spread across the screen like wildfire, and within seconds, the image of a silenced Trump was seared into the minds of millions. And Crockett, oh, she wasn't done yet. Her voice rose above the cheers, firm, cutting through the noise like a blade through fog. You wanted a fight tonight. You wanted a spectacle. But what you got was truth. And truth doesn't bow. Truth doesn't run. Truth doesn't crumble just because you slap a name on it. You can try to mock me, belittle me, even erase me, but I will not be erased. And neither will the millions of Americans who are sick of being called names for simply wanting equality. The roar swelled again, but this time it wasn't just noise, it was affirmation. A tidal wave of energy surged through the hall, through the cameras, spilling into living rooms across America. People weren't just watching. They were feeling. On Twitter, hashtags were already trending. Hashtag trash to treasure, hashtag frozen Trump, hashtag Jasmine Clapback. Clips began to circulate within minutes, reaction videos popping up, influencers replaying her words on live streams, each one amplifying the moment into legend. And yet, the most powerful silence still lingered, Trump's silence. The man who thrived on confrontation, who built his brand on unshakable bravado, now stood frozen, lips tight, eyes darting, as though searching for an escape hatch that didn't exist. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let the silence end there. She had one more card to play, one final revelation that would push the night beyond drama, beyond politics, and into history. The hall simmered with restless electricity. Every breath, every shuffle, every whisper faded into background static, waiting, no, begging, for what Jasmine Crockett would do next. She leaned forward, her gaze locked not only on Trump but on the millions who watched from afar. And with a voice steady as iron, she said, "You call me woke trash, but let's talk about what really stinks. Let's talk about the trail of division you've left behind. The jobs lost when your policies favored the rich. The families broken when your words fueled hate. The soldiers dishonored when you mocked their service. If there is any trash here tonight, it is not the people fighting for justice, it is the corruption, the cruelty, and the chaos you tried to dump on this nation." Gasps broke through the air. Some audience members instinctively clutched their chests, as though they'd just been struck by lightning. Others cheered with ferocity, the sound raw, primal, almost defiant. Trump blinked, his jaw tightening. He shifted in his stance, as if trying to reset his body language. But the cameras caught it, the unease, the crack in his armor. And then Jasmine went further. Her tone dropped lower, almost conspiratorial, pulling the entire room closer, drawing the world into her next line. "And let me remind you, Mr. Trump, this country already rejected your hate once. We rejected it when the ballots were counted. We rejected it when you tried to overturn our democracy. And we will reject it again every single time you show your face and try to sell us fear instead of freedom." The crowd exploded, an eruption that shook the stage. But even louder than the cheers was the sight of Trump, standing in stunned silence, unable to deliver a counterpunch. The man who branded himself as unshakable, unstoppable, indomitable, now cornered, wordless, exposed. And Crockett, without raising her voice, delivered the final turn of the knife. "You call me woke trash? Then hear this, the people you insult, the people you dismiss, they are the ones who keep this country alive. The immigrants who built it. The workers who power it. The young people who will carry it forward. That is America. That is strength. That is truth. And tonight, no insult can bury it." The cameras zoomed in, catching the storm of emotions on faces in the audience, tears, smiles, clenched fists raised high. And in living rooms across the nation, people weren't just spectators, they were participants. Tweeting, posting, cheering at their screens, as though they too were in the room, standing with her. And still, Trump said nothing. Not a word. Just a frozen glare, a moment that would be replayed endlessly, looped on the evening news, dissected in podcasts, etched into the digital bloodstream of America. But the night wasn't done. For after the clash came the reckoning, the aftershocks that would ripple far beyond the debate stage, reshaping narratives, headlines, and perhaps even history itself. The debate hall had fallen into a silence that felt almost sacred. Not the silence of apathy, but the silence of awe, a stunned recognition that something extraordinary had just unfolded. And then, like thunder rolling after lightning, came the roar. Applause, shouts, chants, echoes bouncing off every wall. A storm of sound so overwhelming that even the moderators struggled to bring order back to the stage. But it was too late. The narrative had already escaped the confines of that auditorium. Within seconds, the moment went viral. Phones lit up like fireflies in the night as clips of Crockett's clapback shot across platforms. On Twitter, hashtags erupted, hashtag woke power, hashtag Crockett versus Trump, hashtag truth over trash. On TikTok, teenagers stitched the moment with tears in their eyes, calling it the comeback of the decade. On Facebook, grandmothers posted the clip alongside captions like, "This is the America I believe in." The words were no longer just hers. They belonged to the people. Cable news scrambled to cut in. Anchors leaned forward with the urgency of history unfolding live. Analysts spoke in reverent tones. One network replayed the clip 5 times in a row, unable to resist its gravitational pull. Another called it the sentence heard around the world. Even late-night hosts, known for their cynicism, abandoned jokes for a moment of stunned admiration. One declared, "I've seen politicians shut down hecklers, but I've never seen anyone freeze Donald Trump like that." And Trump himself? He tried to recover. He launched into another monologue, repeating familiar lines, recycling familiar jabs. But the crowd wasn't the same. Every word he spoke landed weaker, thinner, like echoes fading into the distance. For once, he wasn't commanding the spotlight. He was surviving it. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her arms in victory or bask in the cheers. Instead, she stood still, calm, resolute, like a leader who knew the battle wasn't about ego, but about principle. And that choice, that quiet dignity, only amplified her triumph. Across America, living rooms became mini town halls. Families paused dinners, pointing at the screen in disbelief. Workers on night shifts huddled around phones. Students texted furiously in group chats. "Did you see that?" became the most common phrase of the night. Even in corners of the country where Trump's voice had long dominated, there was a subtle shift. Some admitted quietly, reluctantly, that Crockett's words had struck a chord. They might not agree with her politics, but they could not deny her strength. The ripple effects reached beyond politics. Activists saw it as a rallying cry. Comedians saw it as the punchline they'd never need to write. Teachers replayed the moment in classrooms as an example of standing up to bullies. Pastors wove its moral into Sunday sermons. The clash had left the stage. It had entered the bloodstream of culture itself. But the true weight of the moment wouldn't be measured in applause or hashtags. It would be measured in what came after, the battles it inspired, the conversations it sparked, and the way it reshaped not just perception, but possibility. Donald Trump was not a man accustomed to losing control of the narrative. For years, his words had shaped the headlines, bending the day's storylines to his will. But this time, he felt the grip slipping through his fingers. Within minutes of the debate's end, his campaign team rushed into damage control. Emails were drafted. Talking points were circulated. Friendly outlets were called with urgent instructions: downplay it, mock it, frame it as overblown. On his social media, Trump tried to fire back. Posts appeared in rapid succession, dismissing Crockett as overly emotional, branding her unprofessional, and recycling the same dismissive label, woke trash. But instead of erasing her words, his repetition only amplified them. Every insult he typed became a neon sign pointing back to the very moment he wished the world would forget. Meanwhile, Crockett's camp didn't need to spin. They didn't need to amplify. The people were doing it for them. On Twitter, a 15-second clip of her reply surpassed 10 million views in less than an hour. On TikTok, creators remixed her words with dramatic music, cinematic filters, even anime-style fight edits. On Instagram, Reels captured the exact second Trump's face froze, pairing it with captions like, "When the bully finally gets checked." It wasn't just viral. It was cultural combustion. Journalists struggled to keep pace with the tidal wave. Think pieces appeared overnight, the clapback that redefined political courage. How one woman froze Trump in his tracks. Editorial boards, often divided, found rare agreement in one phrase, a turning point. And beyond America's borders, the world watched with fascination. In London, papers described the clash as a Shakespearean duel on live television. In Paris, commentators called it a modern-day David versus Goliath. In Nairobi, radio hosts celebrated Crockett's composure, comparing her calm to that of a seasoned stateswoman. Even in nations where Trump had once commanded respect, the footage struck differently. Leaders, pundits, ordinary citizens, they saw not the unshakable figure he tried to project, but a man who had finally been rattled. But the story wasn't just about Trump. It was about Crockett and what she represented. To her supporters, she became more than a politician. She became a symbol of resilience, of truth spoken without fear, of dignity in the face of insult. To her critics, she was now a force they could no longer dismiss. At rallies, her name was chanted. At protests, her words appeared on cardboard signs. On college campuses, students debated the moment with fiery energy. "This is how you confront hate," one said. "This is how you stand your ground." But perhaps the most telling reaction came from ordinary citizens, people long disillusioned by politics, people who felt unseen. In letters, in emails, in quiet conversations, they spoke the same refrain, "She made me believe again." Yet for all the applause and admiration, there was a storm brewing. For every voice that cheered Crockett's triumph, there were others determined to tear it down. And as the headlines grew louder, the battle shifted from one debate stage to the unforgiving arena of public opinion. No victory comes without resistance. And Crockett's triumph, as electrifying as it was, instantly drew fire. Right-wing pundits lined up to dismiss her moment. On late-night conservative radio, hosts scoffed, it was rehearsed. It was fake. Don't fall for the act. On cable news panels, commentators rolled their eyes, suggesting she was just chasing headlines. Some even went further, digging through her past speeches, cherry-picking quotes, twisting her words into narratives designed to discredit her. And Trump's loyalists? They were relentless. Memes mocking Crockett flooded social media. Hashtags like #TrashCrockett trended, fueled not by organic outrage, but by coordinated campaigns desperate to drown out the applause. It was classic counteroffensive. If they couldn't erase the moment, they would try to bury it beneath noise. But Crockett refused to flinch. When asked about the insults in a post-debate interview, she didn't lash out. She didn't match anger with anger. Instead, she smiled softly and said, "If standing up to bigotry makes me woke trash, then so be it. I'll wear it proudly. Because America was built on people who refuse to stay silent." That single line flipped the script again. What her critics intended as an insult became her badge of honor. #ProudToBeWoke began trending worldwide. The backlash, instead of weakening her, only strengthened her. Each attack provided her a stage to demonstrate poise, resilience, and vision. Each smear campaign exposed the desperation of those threatened by her voice. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the tide of public opinion began to shift. People saw the contrast clearly, on one side, a man hurling insults, on the other, a woman answering with dignity and conviction. Political analysts couldn't ignore it. Polls began to reflect subtle but undeniable movement. Approval ratings ticked upward. In focus groups, undecided voters described her as authentic, fearless, the kind of leader America needs. But the ripple went deeper still. In communities long silenced by fear, Crockett's moment became fuel. Grassroots movements reported surges in volunteers. Donations poured into organizations fighting for justice. High school students launched petitions, college clubs organized rallies, all inspired by the courage they had witnessed on that debate stage. It was no longer just about Crockett versus Trump. It was about what she represented against what he embodied. Yet even as she rose higher, a question loomed: could this wave of momentum be sustained? Or would the relentless machinery of politics, media, and power grind it down before it became something greater? Momentum. It's a fragile thing in politics, fleeting, fickle, easily consumed by the chaos of the next scandal. But in Crockett's case, it didn't fade. It grew. Her debate Clapback didn't remain a viral flash. It became the seed of a narrative, one that spread, rooted itself, and blossomed into something larger than she or her campaign had ever anticipated. Organizations began quoting her in mission statements. Activist groups adopted her words as slogans. Even outside of politics, her line made its way into pop culture. Musicians sampled the moment in their tracks. Street artists painted murals of her face, frozen in that instant of calm defiance. In cities across the country, from Los Angeles to Atlanta to Chicago, you could see her words scrawled across brick walls: "Truth doesn't tremble before insults." But it wasn't just art. It was action. Grassroots campaigns reported record surges in new volunteers. Phone banks, once dwindling, now buzzed with energy. Fundraisers shattered expectations, with small-dollar donations flooding in from people who had never before given a dime to politics. One organizer summed it up simply: she gave people permission to believe again. Meanwhile, Crockett herself handled the momentum with care. She didn't boast. She didn't capitalize recklessly. Instead, she positioned her victory as belonging to everyone. In interviews, she said, "That moment wasn't about me. It was about showing that we don't have to cower before arrogance. It was about reminding America that dignity is stronger than cruelty." Her humility only deepened her impact. The effect rippled internationally. In countries where American politics is often viewed with cynicism, Crockett's moment was seen as a rare beacon of principle. Editorials from London to Sydney praised her composure. Social media users from South America to Asia adopted her words into local movements against corruption, bullying, and injustice. Her voice, though born in a single American debate, had crossed oceans. And yet, with momentum came responsibility. Movements are fragile. They can be co-opted, diluted, or crushed. Crockett's camp knew that the glare of the spotlight could be both a blessing and a burden. Every word she spoke next would carry more weight. Every misstep would be magnified. Still, the choice was clear: retreat into safety, or lean into the power her words had unleashed. And Jasmine Crockett chose the latter. She began touring communities not as a politician making promises, but as a listener. Town halls swelled with people hungry not just for policies, but for the courage she had displayed. On college campuses, she became a folk hero, with students waiting hours just to hear her speak. Everywhere she went, the message was the same: we saw what you did. Show us how to do it too. But as Crockett leaned into her newfound role as a cultural force, those who felt threatened by her rise sharpened their claws. For every cheer that lifted her higher, there were shadows waiting to pull her back down. Every rise invites resistance. And Jasmine Crockett's ascent, so sudden and so potent, terrified the old guard. The political establishment, those who thrived in predictability and backroom deals, saw her momentum as dangerous. A disruptor. A storm they could not control. And so, the whispers began. She's inexperienced. She's emotional. She's untested. Phrases carefully chosen, seeded in op-eds, repeated on cable shows, echoed across podcasts. Not shouted outright, but woven, like threads, into a tapestry of doubt. It was the oldest tactic in politics: diminish the person, not the point. Meanwhile, Trump's allies doubled down. If their insults hadn't silenced her on stage, they would try to bury her under a landslide of outrage. Conservative media branded her a radical, a socialist, a danger to American values. Attack ads sprouted like weeds, splicing her debate moment with ominous music, flashing words like chaos and danger. But the most insidious campaign came not from television, but from the digital shadows. Bot accounts swarmed social media, spreading conspiracy theories about her past, questioning her integrity, planting seeds of distrust. It wasn't about truth. It was about corrosion, wearing down the shine of her moment with endless noise. And yet, she did not falter. Where many would have lashed out defensively, Crockett did something radical: she stayed calm. In interviews, when pressed about the attacks, she leaned back, breathed, and said, "If the worst thing they can say about me is that I stood up with courage, then I'll accept that criticism." Her words disarmed the venom. Her tone, measured, steady, stood in stark contrast to the shrillness of her detractors. And once again, the people noticed. Social media users began responding to smear campaigns not with anger, but with humor. Memes flipped attack ads into parodies. Hashtags mocking the orchestrated outrage gained more traction than the outrage itself. It was as though America had collectively decided, we've seen enough of the noise. We'll trust what we saw with our own eyes. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was this: Crockett's story began inspiring others to speak up. Local leaders who had once played it safe started taking risks. Students who had once stayed silent in classrooms began voicing their truths. Her clapback to Trump was no longer just a viral moment. It had become a blueprint. Still, the question remained: could one viral clash sustain a movement in the long, grinding war of politics? Or was America witnessing a star too bright, destined to burn out as quickly as it had ignited? As the days turned into weeks, something unusual happened. The energy surrounding Jasmine Crockett did not fade. In most news cycles, a viral clip dies within 48 hours, replaced by the next outrage, the next scandal. But Crockett's clapback to Trump lingered. It refused to dissolve into the digital ether. Clips were replayed not just on mainstream news, but in classrooms where professors used them to teach rhetoric. Churches invoked her words in sermons about dignity. Community centers screened the video before local meetings, calling it a moment of courage in modern times. And slowly, what had begun as a single clash began to mutate into something larger. A legacy. Young people in particular gravitated to her. College students wore shirts with her most searing line printed in bold letters. TikTok users remixed her calm delivery with music, turning it into rallying cries set to drums, violins, even hip-hop beats. Crockett herself leaned into the energy, but carefully. She did not rush to declare victory. She did not boast. Instead, she used every platform available to her to return to the issues she had been fighting for all along: justice, equality, and the integrity of democracy. She reminded her growing audience, this is not about me versus him. It's about us versus the silence that has held us back for too long. Those words crystallized her position. Crockett was no longer framed as simply the woman who clapped back at Trump. She was framed as something greater, a symbol of persistence. And symbols are harder to erase than people. The establishment, recognizing the permanence of her influence, began to shift. Some politicians who had once dismissed her cautiously extended invitations. Editorial boards that had once been critical wrote op-eds acknowledging her unexpected gravitas. Even critics admitted that something had changed. But the real proof was not in headlines or political gestures. It was in the voices of everyday Americans. Mothers telling their daughters, "See, that's how you stand tall." Veterans writing letters saying, "You reminded us what courage looks like." High school students flooding her office with handwritten notes, saying, "You gave us a reason to care." The ripple had become a wave. And though no one could predict where the wave might crash, one thing was undeniable: Jasmine Crockett had carved her place in the story of America. But here's the question that now hung in the air: would she wield that place for lasting change, or would America's relentless hunger for the next scandal, the next distraction, eventually drown her voice in noise? It was not just a political moment anymore. It was a cultural marker. Weeks after the clash, late-night hosts still referenced Crockett's reply. Comedians turned the exchange into sketches. Editorial cartoonists immortalized it in ink. Artists painted murals in city squares. One mural in particular became a viral pilgrimage site, a painting of Crockett standing tall on one side, her words emblazoned in fire above her, while on the opposite side stood a faceless caricature of arrogance, pointing and sneering, a shadow of Trump himself. Underneath, the caption read simply, "Dignity cannot be mocked." The phrase spread across the internet like a beacon. Hashtags trended. Social media bios changed. Celebrities adopted the line in interviews. It became a shorthand for anyone, anywhere, standing up against belittlement. Even those who had never watched the full clash felt its echoes. They might not know every word spoken, every glare exchanged, but they knew this: a woman had been insulted in public, and she had answered not with venom, but with power. And so the narrative crystallized into legend. Not just Trump versus Crockett, but something broader, almost mythic, the tale of a voice that refused to be silenced. For Trump, the consequences were subtler but no less real. His words, once enough to spark laughter in his rallies, now carried the weight of backlash. He had underestimated the resilience of his opponent, and in doing so, revealed his own weakness. For Crockett, the consequences were undeniable. She became not just a representative, not just a politician, but a figure woven into the fabric of American discourse. In classrooms, in barbershops, in boardrooms and living rooms, the lesson echoed, "This is how you fight back. With dignity. With fire. With truth." And in that lesson lay the true power of her response. Not just to freeze a crowd. Not just to silence a stage. But to remind an entire nation, in an era of noise, division, and derision, that courage still has the power to cut through. But the question remained, hanging in the air like a challenge to us all: if one voice could do this, what might happen if millions chose to rise the same way? And so, the clash ended. Not with chaos, not with shouting, not with the usual descent into noise. It ended with silence. A silence heavy with realization. A silence in which the crowd, the cameras, and the country were forced to confront what had just unfolded. Donald Trump, the seasoned master of insult and spectacle, had tried once more to turn words into weapons. But in Jasmine Crockett, he met something he could not bend, something he could not break, a voice that refused to yield, a dignity that refused to crumble. Her reply was more than a comeback. It was a lesson. A reminder that true strength is not measured in volume, nor in venom, but in the calm, unshakable fire of truth. And that is why America paused. That is why the moment spread, why the clip replayed again and again across phones, TVs, and conversations. Because in that pause, people recognized something rare, a spark of leadership that felt real, human, and desperately needed. But here's the truth, this was never just about one insult, or one clapback, or even one politician versus another. This was about us. About what kind of nation we choose to be. About whether we accept mockery and cruelty as the norm, or whether we demand better, from our leaders, from our discourse, from ourselves. Crockett's words froze a crowd. But their echo is meant to thaw something in us, courage. The courage to speak up when silence feels easier. The courage to defend dignity when mockery feels louder. The courage to believe that truth, though often quieter, carries more power than hate ever will. So as the lights dim on this chapter, the question lingers. Not what will Jasmine Crockett do next? Though surely her path forward will be watched closely. The deeper question is, what will we do next? Because the story of America has never been written by insults. It has never been defined by arrogance. It has always been shaped, at its best moments, by those who stood firm in the face of mockery and answered not with spite, but with strength. And tonight, as this clash joins the annals of political legend, it reminds us of something simple yet eternal: dignity cannot be mocked. Truth cannot be erased. And when courage meets cruelty, courage will always leave the final word. This is not just their story. It is ours. And the next chapter waits for all of us to write.